Masechet Nazir Daf Kaf He. We were talking about a case in the Mishnah of a woman who becomes a Nazira, designates money for her korbanot, and then her husband annuls it. So now she has this money that's sanctified money. And the Mishnah made a distinction between whether, when she sanctified it, she just said, let's say it's $300, $100 each for each of the animals. If she just said, this $300 is for all my animals, well, that's one thing. That's called setumim. In that case, you take all the money and they would donate it for communal offerings, gift offerings for the mizbeach. The same type that would be given to the mizbeach when it's idle, and so these are just become communal, voluntary offerings. That's ipululin dava. And whereas if she said that this $100 is for the olah, this is for the chatat, this is for the shelamim, well then that's a different story. The one that's for olah, that's okay, because like an animal olah, you can bring a voluntary olah, so you buy an olah and you give a regular olah. The one for shelamim, you would buy an animal for shelamim and it would be offered as a shelamim, although the shelamim would be somewhat like a regular shelamim and somewhat like a shelamim of a nazir. Whereas the chatat is the biggest difference, because you can't just bring a voluntary chatat. So the chatat offering, you have to leave it to die of starvation. That's if you have an animal. If it's money, you have to throw it into the Dead Sea, destroy it. Okay, so that's if you did specify. All right, now here's our question. You said that if you have unspecified funds, unallocated funds, then it all goes to voluntary communal offerings. Hold on. 100 of the 300 is surely for a chatat, although you didn't specify that this 100 is for a chatat and that 100 is for shalamim. Nevertheless, within the 300, part of it is for chatat. So who says that you can take unallocated money, even though some of it will eventually be for chatat? Who said that you can use that for voluntary offerings? We're going to have two answers. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halachahi ben Nazir. Rabbi Yochanan says, you're right, this is just a special halacha in Nazir. It's an oral tradition that for a Nazir, different from other things, because as long as you didn't specify what the money is going for, so it doesn't take effect that it's specifically chatat yet, and therefore you can use it for voluntary offerings. All right. Shakish amad lechol nidrehem lechol nidbotam. Pasuk in Vayikra. Torah amra motar neder yehe lindava. Because this pasuk compares neder to nedava, and lechol. What do you mean? All nedarim. It means, and we already have Pesukim in the beginning of Vayikra that give us the details of every law and everything. So what are these Pesukim coming to add? Anything that you have made a neder and it's superfluous because she's no longer a nazira, so she doesn't have to bring these animals. She doesn't have to use this money. What do you do with it? L'chol nidvotam. Use it for a nedava. So Torah says motar neder, any surplus and funds or animals for that you had because of a vow, like a vow of nizirut, that goes to a nedava. So whereas Rabbi Yochanan says this is simply a halacha special to Nazir, that Shakish says no, actually it comes from a pasuk and would apply to any case where you have this kind of superfluous funds, that it goes to a nedava. Good. Now let's test out each of these claims. Bishla amal Rabbi Yochanan damar halachahi benazir ametulahachi situmin in meforashin la. Since Rabbi Yochanan said this is a particular exception that the oral law gives us for a nazir, therefore we can understand why, if it's unspecified funds, then it goes to nedava. Whereas if I specified this $100 is for chatat, then not so. That's part of the oral tradition. It said this only applies to unspecified, doesn't affect specified. Fine, Rabbi Yochanan, that makes sense. אלא ריש לקיש לכל נדריהם ולכל נדבותם, מה יעשו תומין אפילו מפורשים. But you, Rish Lakish, you're learning it from Pasuk. This Pasuk doesn't say anything about whether it's specified or unspecified. So why are you saying only if it's unspecified? Even if I specified it, since you're learning it from here, so kol nidrehem, I made a vow, and I said this $100 is specified for hatat, but now it's superfluous, so let it be a nedava also. Why would the Mishnah make a distinction? If we follow your derivation, Resh Lakish, that's the question. Amarava meforashin lamasit amart kevar pesakah tana deber Rabbi Ishmael rak kadashecha asher yu lecha undarecha bivlade kodashim bitmuratam hakatub medaber. Rava says, I have an answer that if you specified it, then you cannot apply that pasuk because we have another tradition that will counter it. And this tradition was taught in a braita from the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Then this braita quotes a pasuk in Devarim that says only, rak is we're gonna learn something from the word rak, a limitation. Kadashecha, holy, consecrated things that asher yu lecha undarecha. Now this pasuk, in Peshat, Nedarim is giving a general rule that anything kadosh you have to bring to the Bet HaMikdash, to the one place, to Yerushalayim. Okay. In the context of the Devarim, it's to the Mishkan, right, wherever it is. Okay, but here the rabbi is saying, okay, all these Pisukim and Devarim, what are they coming to add that we don't know already? And so since it says Asher yu lecha, that they are, and it's related to neder, this must be referring to something that becomes consecrated as a result of some neder. Not directly, but indirectly. And that could happen in two cases. One, velade kadashim. If someone has a female shelamim animal that's consecrated, and now, before I get a chance to sacrifice it, right, I'm taking it, I'm on my way to Yerushalayim, and the animal is pregnant and gives birth. What do I do with this baby? It's also consecrated, but I can't use it for my shelamim vow because I have the mom, right? The mom is still good. I'm going to use the mom. What do I do with this? It's superfluous. So that's case one. And the second case is any sacred animal that I make a temura. I say, you know what? I don't want animal A. I want to switch it for animal B. And we know you're not allowed to do that. And if you do that, then both A and B are both sanctified. So now B is going to be also superfluous because I already have A around. I don't need B to fulfill that vow. So that's what we're talking about. Okay, so all these things, what should you do with them? Let's continue reading on in the pasuk. Matakanatan tisa ubata el makom asher yibchar Hashem. You should carry them and bring them to the place that Hashem will choose, which eventually will be Yerushalayim. Good. So bring them to Yerushalayim. Fine. Now, what do I do with them in Yerushalayim? Yachol yalem lebet habechira v'imna mehem mayim mazon b'shvil sheyamutu. Well, maybe it just means I have to bring them to the Temple Mount, but then I could put them there, and maybe I have to give them no food and no water, so that they'll die of hunger, die of starvation, right? Like we could do with chatat. So maybe it just means I have to do it there. I have to bring it there, and I have to do that, let it die there. No, Talmud Omar, keep reading on in the pasuk, right? It's all one continuous pasuk here. Ve'asita olotecha habasar ve'hadam. You offer it, right? It's flesh, it's blood. You actually offer it on the altar. So we learn from here that if I have an animal that's specified, right, or coins that are specified, and they become superfluous, right, here this beraita talks about two cases of it becoming superfluous because I tried to substitute it or because it gave birth. But we'll learn the same thing for this woman who was Nazira, and now she's no longer Nazira because her husband annulled it, and now she has this money that is an animal or money that's specified. So what is she going to do with it? This pasuk tells you if it's specified, you have to bring an animal and sacrifice it, an olah or a shelamim. Lomar lecha kederach shata noheg beolah nehog betmurata kederach shata noheg b'shlamim nehog bivladehem. And so applies to olah. Whatever you would do with an olah, If you substitute it, then you have to do the same thing with animal B that you substituted it with. That is going to become also an olah. And whatever you do with shilamim, so too, if the shilamim gives birth to a baby, then you have to offer the baby also as a shilamim offering. Olah, by the way, can only be males, so you can never have an olah animal that gives birth to another. So that's why that's why it gives an example of olah. It uses timurah, and that's why for shilamim it can only use shilamim. The example for a valad, something that gives birth, can only be given for a shilamim, whereas timurah could be both, but one having a child could only be shilamim. So that's why he breaks it up in this way. Now, Yachol af velad hatat utmurat asham ken tamod omar rak divrei Rabbi Ishmael. This is the end of the braita. Now, since I had said all this by the time I got here, I understand that whenever you have a superfluous animal, you have to offer as a sacrifice. So that's true for olah. It's true for shilamim. So maybe it's also true for a hatat and asham. If they have a child or they are substituted, and now I have a superfluous one. No, the pasuk says rak. Rak is a limitation word. This only applies to certain sacrifices and not others. And so that's this is the baraita of Rabbi Ishmael, and this is Rava's answer to the question that we had against Resh Lakish, right? Just a quick review. First, we were wondering this within the money. If you have unspecified funds, there's some chatat money in them. Who says you could take this unspecified funds? Some of it is going to be chatat and bring a korban for it. So Yochanan says it's just a tradition. Resh Lakish learned it from pasuk. But if you're learning from that pasuk, then why distinguish between unspecified and specified? Maybe even specified funds. You should take any neder that's superfluous and make it a nedava. And our answer is that we learn it from this pasuk in Devarim. Rabbi Ishmael distinguished between shilamim and olah. That, yes, if it's superfluous, even if it's specified, then you give it you make it a sacrifice instead. But for chatat and asham, the word rak says no. If it's specified, you cannot do that. Okay, we're about to see that chatat and asham actually will be treated differently. The chatat is you left to die with no food, and that's because you can't do anything with it. Asham, on the other hand, you'll let it graze till it gets a blemish, and after it gets a blemish, then you take its value, you sell it, take its value, and buy a korban olah. Okay, so you don't have to cause it to die. All right, so that was the answer from the braita of Rabbi Ishmael. Continuing that braita for a moment, Rabbi Akiva omer eno sarich harehu omer asham hu b'avayato yehe. Rabbi Akiva agrees with everything above, including that the word rak says hatat is different. Hatat, you can't bring a korban hatat if it's superfluous. You have to let it die. But for asham, that we don't need the word rak to exclude asham, because for asham we have in the main place where we learned about asham, Vayikra Perek He, it says asham hu, it is an asham, meaning that we learn from there only it, the original animal that was designated for an asham, that one can be sacrificed, but not a substitute. Right? If you substitute one in asham for something else, then you again you let it graze, and then you buy an olah animal and you do offer it. But you don't need the word rak for an asham, because asham has its own pasuk. All right, good. So now we answered the question of Resh Lakish. We're going to analyze a couple of sections of that baraita that we just brought. Katane yachol ya'alem lebet ha'bechira v'yimna mehem mazon u'mayim u'mazon b'shvil sheyamutu tamod lomar ve'asita olotecha. Amai ha velad hatat hu digmirin ba'mita. So we're going back in the Baraita where we had a hava amina when we're wondering, okay, what do you do with a superfluous animal that is sanctified, but we don't need it for its original purpose? And so the pasuk says you bring it up to Jerusalem. Now we wondered at that point, we're going to freeze there in the logical step. and said, well, maybe you bring it to Jerusalem, and all that means is that you don't give it any food or water until it dies, but you have to do it in Jerusalem. Who said it means that you actually have to also sacrifice it, that you can sacrifice it? That's why the rest of the pasuk says, "Ve'asita olotecha," that olah and shelamim, you actually sacrifice it. All right, good. So we needed this pasuk to teach us that. Now we're going to wonder, wait a second, why do we need this pasuk to teach us that you can sacrifice an olan shelamim? After all, velad hatat, we have an oral tradition, halachal shemisinai, that a chatat offering, that if a chatat has a child, and now it's a superfluous chatat, that you have to let it die. Now, if there's an oral tradition specifically about chatat that you have to let it die, that implies that other types of sacrifices, you don't let them die. So this hava amina is impossible. We end up rejecting the hava amina because it says vasita olotecha, but the Gemara's question is, even without vasita olotecha, if it just says you have to take your olah and shilamim, that's superfluous, and bring them up to Jerusalem, well, obviously, it's not to bring it to Jerusalem to die, because that's for korban hatat. It's oral tradition, and only korban hatat that is done. So I would know it's not to die; rather, it means to sacrifice. And so the answer is no. There is another hava amina I could have thought. Ilav keda hava amina velad hatat bechol makom uvlade kodashim bebet habechira kamashma landela. I might have thought that you're right. In fact, all of them, if they're superfluous, have to die. The difference is that the oral tradition about hatat comes to teach us that you could let it die anywhere. If I have a korban hatat that I designated in Tel Aviv, and that becomes and now I don't need it anymore, I could let it die in Tel Aviv. I don't have to bring it to Jerusalem to let it die there. So I could do it at anywhere. Whereas the pasuk here in Devarim says, bring it to the Temple Mount. That's talking about other non-chatat animals. I have to bring it there and let it die. But I might have thought that all of them you have to let die, and that's why the rest of the pasuk says vasita olotecha. No, if it's an olah offering, make it an olah offering. If it's shelamim, bring it as a shelamim offering. Okay, so that explains why we could have possibly had a hava amina that everything would be brought to Jerusalem just to die there. All right, Katane, another part of the Braita. Yachol af velad hatat utmurat asham ken tamod lomar rak. Lamali kera hilcheta gemirila. So Braita also says, maybe for a child, sanctified child of a chatat, or a replacement for an asham, in other words, a superfluous chatat and asham, maybe I would also say that, like the olah and shelamim, you can bring them to Jerusalem and offer them as a hatat and asham. That's why the pasuk in Devarim starts with rak. This law that you can sacrifice on the altar a superfluous animal only applies to some, olah and shelamim, but not to hatat and asham. We have a question. Why do I need this pasuk, this rak? We already have a halachal shemisinai that we just mentioned, that a sanctified child of a korban hatat has to die. So we know that I'm not going to sacrifice it from the oral law. Whereas interesting interplay, right? Because you have certain pisukim that we're assuming the extra word there, the word rak, is coming to exclude something, but we also have the oral law, and so the oral law already excludes it, and so they have to work together, right? What you learn from the written law and from the oral law have to match up, and if the oral law tells you that there's something for a chatat, then you wouldn't need the written law. It's interesting logic, because in other places you say, well, I have this oral law. Where do I know it from, right? What's a hint? What's a derivation in the written law? So you might say, oh, the derivation is from rak. Okay, but here, the Gemara is not taking that way. It's saying, no, this is a superfluous pasuk about a superfluous sanctified animal. And so the answer is, Hachiname, ukra la'asham hudata. You're right. I don't need the word rak to exclude the korban hatat. I would know that a korban hatat that's superfluous, it has to be left to die. So the word rak here is not teaching me anything about korban hatat, but rather only about korban asham. Okay. Now we ask, asham name hilcheta gemirila kol sheilu behatat meta ba'asham ro'eh. No, we have a halacha also that we know from the oral tradition about asham, that anything that would, if in a similar instance, if you would take a chatat and it would be superfluous and you have to let it die, if an asham is in the same scenario, like if you do a temurah, then also you should you should not let it die, but rather let it graze, get a blemish, and then take its value and buy an olah, right? That's the equivalent thing you do. Now, so we also have a tradition about an asham that you don't actually sacrifice that very asham. So I don't need the word rak, not for chatat and not for asham. So why do I need the word rak? The answer is Ela ime hilcheta hava amina hilcheta v'yakribeh la lechayev ale v'lo kelum kamash malan kerad im akriv le kaim ale be'aseh. If I had only the halacha, I would have thought, okay, yes, it's a halacha that a korban asham, you're not supposed to sacrifice it. But what if bidi avad you did sacrifice that very animal that became superfluous as an asham? I might have thought then, if I had only the halacha, then I would say, well, there's no punishment for that. There's no you're not liable. So therefore, we need a pasuk to say that you are liable, because the pasuk says, rak, these animals, olah and shelamim, you bring as a sacrifice, but not, rak says, but not in asham. Therefore, if you do bring it b'di'avad, you violated in asham. There's still no punishment for violating an aseh, but you are liable for transgressing a misvat aseh. And so that's why I have the word rak, to add an extra level of liability beyond the oral tradition. Good. Now, lastly, Rabbi Akiva omer eno sarich. Hare omer asham hu bahavayato yeheh. So now we're going to ask the same thing that we just asked for Rabbi Ishmael. We're going to ask for Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva already said, hey, I don't need the word rak to exclude an asham, because I know that an asham can only be offered as is, from the pasuk regarding asham in Vayikra Perek says asham hu. Only the original asham I can bring in as an asham, but some substitute, a superfluous asham, I cannot bring. So, according to Rabbi Akiva, why do I need the pasuk of rak? Gemara gemirila kol shebechatat meta ba'asham ro'eh. We have an oral tradition for chatat. We have an oral tradition for asham. That if it's a superfluous asham, then it has to be you let it graze and buy an olah instead with it. And here you can't give the same answer that the pasuk is coming to teach you a misvat, that if you do violate, then it's a misvat aseh. You violated misvat aseh if you do offer it, because here this just says asham hu. It's not saying, there's no positive misvah here, and that's where you're learning the law of asham from. So, question to Rabbi Akiva, since we already have a halacha Moshe Sinai about asham, why do you need this pasuk asham hu? And the answer is hachanameh. You're right. I really know the law that asham, you take it out to graze. I know that from this oral tradition. And what is the pasuk coming to teach? As follows: V'chi ata kera liderav, to teach me something about what Rav said. Tamar Rav Huna Amar Rav, asham shenitak lid'aya ushchato l'shem olah kasher. Rav said, if you have an asham that is designated to go and graze, in other words, it's a superfluous asham, and so we can't offer it as is, so we let it graze, and then it gets a blemish, and we'll sell it and buy an olah. However, that's what you should do lechatechila. If b'di'avad, you took that very superfluous asham animal, and you did shechita, and you offered it as an olah sacrifice, it's a valid sacrifice. Okay, that's what I've said. Now, Tama dinitak ha lo nitak la damar kera hu ba'avayato yeheh. The only reason why it's a valid sacrifice is because it was an asham, but it's superfluous, and we already gave it to the farmer and said, here, take this and let it get a blemish, and then we'll change it out, sell it, and take its value for an olah. So that only in that case, b'di'avad, you can bring it as an olah. But if it's a regular asham and it's not superfluous, I actually need it for an asham, and then for some reason I brought it as an olah, that's no good. You cannot do that. It's an olah sacrifice. You can't take an olah and bring it as, you can't take an asham and bring it as an olah. How do I know? Because the pasuk says hu, meaning bahavayato yeheh. If it's an asham and it currently is a kosher, valid asham, I have to bring it as an asham. I can't bring it as something different from what it was designated. So therefore that's what the word asham hu means. That if it's a regular good asham, I have to bring it as an asham. Only the oral tradition teaches that only if it's a superfluous asham, then b'di'avad, if I bring it as an olah, then it's still kosher. So we solve that problem as well, and we'll see more analysis of the sections of the Braita on the next stuff. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.